What do you do with the Phalaenopsis with a long stem? This one is really wobbly, it's kind of falling out of the pot, and it's very top heavy. Stay tuned to see how I repot this plant to give it a nice makeover. Hi, welcome to Attainable Green. I'm Jess, and today we're going to be talking about repotting a Phalaenopsis with a long stem. I'm going to share with you the steps I go through and how to problem solve and figure out how to repot this particular Phalaenopsis. Now, to give you a little bit of background, this is a fairly old plant and it has never been repotted. As you can see, it has its original nursery pot with some sphagnum moss that has been heavily degraded. Over time, the plant has grown taller and taller, and the aerial roots have tried to go down into the media. After a while, this plant just became very top heavy and wobbly in the pot. So as you can see right now, it looks a little bit dehydrated, and when this plant was given to me, the person basically said, "This plant is dying and I don't know if you can save it, but here you go." So I took this plant on as kind of a challenge, and out of all the plants that I had received as rescues, this one was the one that really stuck out to me. As you can tell, it is a very old plant. It has bloomed multiple times before along the stem, and currently it's not in the best condition. It has been a little bit neglected and dehydrated. And as you can tell, it's not a very happy plant. So this plant definitely needs a little bit of help. Looking at this really long stem and all of these aerial roots, it definitely needs a repot. Now, the biggest thing to check is if the roots in the pot are viable. And looking at it now, it's very desiccated. A lot of the roots are looking pretty shrunken, pretty dried, and I don't think there's much life along the roots that are actually in the pot. So if I cut the lower portion of the stem, that may save me some trouble of unpotting the entire plant and figuring out how to repot all of those roots. So looking along the stem, I have found a point that has a division between live healthy roots and kind of dead, dried, desiccated ones. So I'm going to make a cut along this portion of the stem to see if the remainder bottom portion is dead or alive. So after the stem is cut, I noticed that the base is completely dead. It's brown, it's dried out, there is no life left in this bottom portion of the plant. That definitely makes it easier for me to do this repot because I don't have to concern myself with this bottom half of the plant. If the stem was still green, I could put it aside, and hopefully a keiki or another small plantlet may grow from that second half of the stem. In this case, it doesn't apply, so this portion of the plant is going to be tossed aside. Now looking at the remaining part of the plant and looking at that cut, once again, I can see that that part is still dried off. Now, because the bottom part of this stem is brown and dried off, I don't have to worry about sealing the wound. So I don't have to use any cinnamon or wax or anything to make sure that there are no fungal infections or bacterial infections that can get into this orchid. I'm not going to cut any deeper into any healthy tissue because for my purposes, I just want to get it into the pot, and the pot itself is deep enough so that the stem doesn't get in the way. Now, looking at all of the aerial roots, it is quite extensive and they're all pretty much healthy. And I'm just going to put all of these aerial roots into the pot itself. When it comes to roots on a Phalaenopsis, they are adapted to the media that it's growing in. And since this was growing in air, it's adapted to air. And most of the time we call these aerial roots. Now, because I need to pot up this plant, all of these aerial roots are going into the pot. And I'm going to use a light airier mix so that the roots can get used to having moisture around its root zone. There's going to be a bit of an acclimation process during this time, so I think some of the roots may adapt and hopefully some new roots will emerge so that the entire plant can sustain itself. Right now, we're kind of heading towards the beginning of summer, and so this is kind of the perfect time to repot. You just want to make sure that new growth is going to start, new roots will emerge, and that way the plant itself will thrive much better than during any other time of the season. I'm using cocoa husk to pot up this plant because it's nice and airy and chunky, and I know that over time, as the roots starting adapting to a more moisture-loving setup, then the cocoa husk will break down and retain more moisture, and that way the roots roots and the media itself will adapt together so that in the beginning it'll be a drier setup and I'll water slightly more often. But over time, I'm hoping that as the media starts to break down and the roots adapt more gradually to having more moisture around its root zone, it will be fine in a more moisture retentive setup. The roots of this plant is pretty extensive, so I don't have to worry about not having roots for this plant to sustain itself. It definitely has a good portion of root mass. So I feel very confident that this plant will adapt pretty well to being in a pot. Now, when it comes to the leaves of this plant, you can see there are so many leaves, it practically looks like a vanda. All of the leaves are very, very dehydrated. They're floppy, they're falling over, they're very wrinkled and shriveled, and I think the bottom leaves are so thin that they pretty much feel like very rough paper. So I know that during this acclimation process, a good portion of these leaves are going to fall off and die. I'm okay with that, and that's part of the process because the leaves can only sustain so much stress before it decides that it's going to completely die off. Looking at the crown of the plant, that is the future for this Phalaenopsis. Now, the uppermost leaf is fairly floppy, still growing, but at the core and the base closest to the stem, that area is still very firm and rigid. So that is a good sign that this plant is really pushing and trying to stay alive. Now looking at the leaf right adjacent to it, that one still retains some of its rigidity. And I'm hoping that as this plant is more hydrated, that second leaf will start to firm up as well. Now overall, the look of this plant is gonna look like this for quite some time. It's still gonna have those curved leaves, it's still gonna have that kind of floppy look to the plant, but all the new growth should be looking quite firm, and it should kind of grow straight. So if you're going to look at the topmost growth, all of the new leaves should be growing at about a 45-degree angle, and as you feel it, it should be nice and firm. This repot is giving this plant a makeover, not only by just putting it in a pot and improving its appearance, but it's giving it a second chance at growing roots and becoming more hydrated, so that in the future it'll be healthy and hopefully it will one day flower again. I have no idea what the flowers will be like, so that will be an interesting discovery once that happens. For now, I'm just trying to get this plant to be acclimated to being back in a pot. Hopefully I will be able to share some updates about this plant as it's recovering from the stress of being neglected. So this is how I dealt with a Phalaenopsis with a long stem. Luckily, it was a fairly straightforward process. It just took some time to maneuver and get all the roots back into the pot. And there is an acclimation process so that this plant can grow and get accustomed to being in media. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, Attainable Green, to follow along on my orchid growing journey. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!